For 43 years, I was respected as an elder, but it all began when I was only 12 years old. 12. I could barely choose breakfast, yet I was signing my life sentence. They called it baptism, but it was the perfect snare. Invisible chains that stole my entire existence, and today I'll reveal how they did it. My name is Raymond Mitchell, and I'm 67 years old now. For 43 years of my life, I served as a respected elder in the Jehovah's Witnesses organization here in the small town of Millbrook Valley. But today, sitting in my quiet kitchen with my morning coffee, I need to tell you something that's been eating at my soul for years. Something about how they trapped me before I was old enough to understand what I was signing up for. They call it baptism, but what it really is the perfect snare to capture young souls before they can think for themselves. I was only 12 years old when they dunked me under that water in front of hundreds of people at the summer assembly. 12 years old. Can you imagine that? At 12, I couldn't even decide what I wanted for breakfast most mornings, let alone make a lifelong commitment that would control every aspect of my existence for decades to come. But there I was, wearing that white shirt that was too big for my skinny frame, walking down into that makeshift pool they'd set up in the gymnasium, completely oblivious to the invisible chains they were about to lock around my wrists. My parents, Harold and Margaret Mitchell, had been witnesses since before I was born. They were what the organization calls spiritual pillars in our congregation, the Millbrook Valley Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses. My father was a ministerial servant, always dressed in his pressed suits, always carrying that weathered brown leather service bag filled with Watchtower magazines and Bible study books. My mother was a pioneer, spending 70 hours every month, knocking on doors, trying to convert anyone who would listen to their interpretation of God's word. Looking back now, I can see how carefully they orchestrated everything. From the time I could barely speak, they had me attending 5 meetings a week at that Kingdom Hall: Tuesday night book study, Thursday night ministry school, Sunday morning Watchtower study, Sunday afternoon public talk, and don't forget the Saturday morning field service, where we drag our tired feet from door to door in our Sunday best, interrupting people's weekend peace to tell them their religion was wrong, and ours was the only path to salvation. The pressure started building when I turned 11. Other kids my age were getting baptized, and suddenly everyone was asking me when I would take the step. Brother Williams, our circuit overseer, would pat me on the head after meetings and say things like, "Raymond, don't you want to dedicate your life to Jehovah? Don't you want to be part of his organization?" The way he said it made it sound like the most natural thing in the world, like asking if I wanted ice cream on a hot day. But what they never told me, what they carefully kept hidden behind all their smiles and encouraging words, was what that baptism really meant. They never explained that once I went under that water, I would be bound by their rules, as if I were a grown man. They never mentioned that if I ever questioned their teachings, ever doubted their authority, ever wanted to live a different life, I would face something they called disfellowshipping, being cut off completely from every person I'd ever known and loved. The night before my baptism, I remember lying in my narrow bed in our modest 2-bedroom house on Elm Street, staring up at the ceiling and feeling this strange knot in my stomach. It wasn't excitement, though that's what I told everyone who asked. It was something else, something I couldn't name at 12 years old. Looking back, I think it was my soul trying to warn me, trying to tell me to run before it was too late. My mother came into my room that night, sat on the edge of my bed and smoothed my hair back from my forehead the way she used to when I was little and had nightmares. "Tomorrow is going to be the most important day of your life, Raymond," she whispered, and I could see tears glistening in her eyes in the dim light from the hallway. "Tomorrow, you become one of Jehovah's people forever." Forever. That word should have terrified me, but at 12, forever felt like make-believe, like something that happened to other people in stories. I had no concept of what forever actually meant, no understanding that I was about to sign away my right to think for myself, to choose my own path, to question anything they told me was God's will. The morning of the baptism arrived grey and drizzling, which seemed fitting now that I think about it. We drove 40 minutes to the district assembly in the city, our old Ford station wagon loaded down with coolers full of sandwiches and thermoses of coffee, because witnesses always brought their own food to these events. Can't risk eating something from worldly vendors who might not follow the organization's dietary guidelines. The gymnasium was packed with maybe 800 people, all dressed in their meeting clothes, all buzzing with excitement about the day's program. But the real excitement was reserved for the baptism ceremony. They had set up 2 portable pools at the front of the hall, and I could see other candidates, mostly teenagers and a few adults, sitting in the front rows in their white clothes, looking nervous and excited when they called my name, along with 17 others, to come forward for the baptism. My legs felt like jelly. The entire crowd turned to look at us, and I could hear people whispering, "Oh, look how young he is, and what a blessing to start serving Jehovah so early." But all I could think about was how cold that water was going to be, and how many people were watching. Brother Thompson, the district overseer, was doing the baptizing that day. He was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and a voice that boomed across the gymnasium when he gave talks. When it was my turn, he put his large hand on my back and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Raymond Mitchell, based on your dedication to Jehovah, I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and God's Spirit-directed organization." That last part, God's Spirit-directed organization, those words didn't mean much to me then. I thought it was just fancy religious talk. I had no idea that those words were actually making me property of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, binding me to obey their every command as if it came directly from God himself. The water was freezing, and when he pushed me under, I came up gasping and shivering. But the crowd erupted in applause, and people were crying and praising Jehovah, and my parents were beaming with pride from their seats in the middle section. In that moment, surrounded by all that love and acceptance and approval, I felt like I had done something truly special. If only I had known that what I had actually done was walked into the most sophisticated trap ever devised by human beings. A trap designed specifically to capture children before their critical thinking skills fully developed, before they understood concepts like psychological manipulation, before they realized they had the right to say no. The ride home that day was filled with congratulations and talk about my new responsibilities as one of Jehovah's baptized servants. My father kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror with this proud smile, telling me how mature I was for my age, how Jehovah was surely going to bless me for my dedication. My mother twisted around in her seat to squeeze my hand and tell me this was just the beginning of a beautiful life of service to God. What none of us understood, what the organization made sure we never understood, was that I had just become a prisoner. Oh, they didn't call it that. They called it being in the truth, being part of God's chosen people, being separate from the world. But underneath all those beautiful-sounding phrases was a simple, terrifying reality. I now belonged to them, and if I ever tried to leave, they would make sure I lost everything and everyone I had ever cared about. The years that followed my baptism were like living in a beautifully decorated prison cell. Everything looked perfect from the outside, but I was slowly suffocating under the weight of rules I had never truly agreed to follow. By the time I turned 16, I was already giving talks from the platform at our Kingdom Hall, standing behind that wooden podium in my cheap suit and tie, delivering rehearsed speeches about Bible topics I barely understood, but had memorized perfectly. The congregation loved me. I was their golden boy, the young brother who had dedicated his life to Jehovah at such a tender age. Sister Patterson would always grab my arm after meetings and tell other sisters how blessed the organization was to have young men like me. Brother Davis, our presiding overseer, would use me as an example during his talks, pointing to me in the audience and saying things like, "Look at young Raymond. He didn't wait until he was older to serve Jehovah. He recognized the truth early and acted on it." But what they saw as spiritual maturity was actually just conditioning. I had been trained from infancy to say the right words, to nod at the right moments, to raise my hand when they asked questions during the Watchtower study. I could recite their doctrines perfectly, explain their interpretations of Bible prophecy with confidence, and defend their teachings against anyone who challenged them. But underneath all that programming, I was just a confused teenager who had never been allowed to think for himself. The first crack in my faith appeared when I was 17 and started noticing things that didn't add up. Our Kingdom Hall received a letter from the Watchtower headquarters in Brooklyn, New York, announcing new light on a prophecy that had been taught as absolute truth for decades. Suddenly, what had been God's revealed word last month was now considered old understanding that needed to be discarded. When I asked Brother Davis how God could change his mind about something so important, he looked at me with concern and quoted Proverbs about the path of the righteous getting brighter and brighter. That answer should have satisfied me, but it didn't. If these men in Brooklyn were truly getting their information directly from Jehovah, why did they keep having to correct themselves? Why were there so many changes to fundamental doctrines? Why did questioning these changes make me feel guilty, like I was somehow betraying God himself? I started paying more attention during meetings, but not in the way the elders wanted me to. Instead of just absorbing the information, I began analyzing it, looking for logical inconsistencies, comparing what they taught now with what they had taught in older publications. The more I studied their own literature, the more contradictions I found. Dates for Armageddon that had come and gone, prophecies that had failed, medical advice that had killed people, all explained away as imperfect men doing their best to serve a perfect God. But the real awakening came when I turned 21 and met Linda Crawford at a district assembly in the neighboring city. She was 19, beautiful in that wholesome way that witness girls were supposed to be, with long brown hair always neatly pinned back and modest dresses that never revealed too much. Her father was an elder in their congregation, and her mother was a pioneer just like mine had been. We were, by every measure the organization used, a perfect match. Linda was different from other girls I had known in the organization. She asked questions, real questions, not the rehearsed ones they taught us to ask during Bible studies with interested people. She wondered why women couldn't give talks to mixed audiences, why they had to wear head coverings when praying in front of men, why their only acceptable role in the organization was to support their husbands and raise children to serve Jehovah. We would sit in her parents' living room after meetings, ostensibly studying together, but actually talking about things that bothered us about the organization. She told me about sisters who had been counseled for working full-time jobs instead of pioneering, about families torn apart because one member had been disfellowshipped, about young people who had committed suicide rather than face the shame of being cut off from everyone they loved. Those conversations with Linda opened my eyes to something I had never fully grasped before. The Jehovah's Witnesses weren't just another religion with strict rules. They were a high-control group that used fear, guilt, and social pressure to maintain absolute authority over their members. The baptism I had undergone at 12 wasn't a symbol of my dedication to God. It was a contract that gave them ownership of my life. We married 2 years later in a simple ceremony at the Kingdom Hall, with a reception in the basement where we served cake and punch to 200 guests, all of whom were Jehovah's Witnesses. No music, no dancing, no celebration. That might be considered too worldly. Just speeches about how marriage was a gift from Jehovah and how Linda and I were blessed to be starting our life together in the truth. I was appointed as a ministerial servant 6 months after our wedding, which meant I was now part of the congregation's hierarchy. I helped with accounts, literature distribution, and sound equipment during meetings. More importantly, I was being groomed for greater responsibilities. Brother Davis pulled me aside after meetings to give me counsel on handling various congregation matters, teaching me the unwritten rules about how to maintain order and discipline among the rank and file members. By the time I turned 28, I'd been appointed as an elder. This was the culmination of everything my parents had dreamed of when they encouraged me to get baptized at 12. Their son was now one of the spiritual shepherds of the flock, trusted with the most sensitive congregation matters, respected and looked up to by everyone in the Kingdom Hall. But being an elder meant seeing behind the curtain in ways I had never anticipated. I sat in judicial committee meetings where we decided whether to disfellowship members for various sins. I watched grown men debate whether a teenage girl's skirt was too short, whether a brother's goatee was appropriate for someone representing Jehovah's organization, whether a sister's job at a company that manufactured birthday cards constituted supporting false religious practices. The power was intoxicating at first. People came to me with their problems, their questions, their confessions. They looked at me with respect and fear, hanging on my every word as if I was speaking for God Himself. When I gave talks from the platform, the congregation listened with rapt attention, taking notes, nodding their heads in agreement with whatever interpretation of Scripture I presented. But the more authority I gained, the more I began to understand the true nature of the organization I was serving. We weren't shepherds caring for sheep, we were prison guards maintaining control over inmates. Every rule, every policy, every procedure was designed to keep members dependent, isolated, and afraid to question anything. Linda and I had been trying to have children for several years without success, and the pressure from the organization was becoming unbearable. Sisters would ask her constantly when she was going to give me children, implying that her failure to get pregnant was somehow a spiritual failing. The elders suggested we pray more, study more, attend meetings more regularly, as if having a baby was something we could earn through increased devotion to the organization. When we finally decided to see a fertility specialist, the congregation's response was mixed. Some supported our decision, but others questioned whether we were showing enough faith in Jehovah's ability to open Linda's womb. Brother Thompson, who had baptized me all those years ago, suggested that perhaps God didn't want us to have children because we weren't spiritually ready for the responsibility of raising Jehovah's Witnesses. The tests revealed that I was the one with fertility issues, not Linda. The doctor explained that there were treatments available, but they would be expensive and time-consuming, with no guarantee of success. We decided to try anyway, using money we had been saving for a down payment on a house. But month after month, year after year, the treatments failed. Linda's faith began to waver during this period. She couldn't understand why a loving God would deny us the blessing of children when we had devoted our entire lives to serving Him. She started missing meetings occasionally, claiming she was too tired or didn't feel well. Other sisters began to notice, and soon the elders were asking me to have a talk with my wife about her spiritual condition. That conversation changed everything between us. When I tried to counsel Linda about her meeting attendance, she looked at me with eyes full of pain and anger and said something I will never forget. "Raymond, don't you see what they've done to us? They've turned you into one of them. You're more concerned about what the elders think than you are about your own wife's heartbreak." She was right, and I knew it. Somewhere along the way, I had become so focused on maintaining my position in The organization that I had forgotten what it meant to be a husband, a friend, a human being with his own thoughts and feelings. The 12-year-old boy who had walked into that baptism pool had disappeared completely, replaced by a man who spoke their language, thought their thoughts, and enforced their rules without question. But Linda's words planted a seed of doubt that began to grow larger every day. I started looking at my fellow elders with new eyes, noticing how they wielded their authority, how they seemed to enjoy the fear and respect their positions commanded. I began to see the organization not as God's channel of communication on earth, but as a business that sold salvation in exchange for complete obedience. You know what, my dear friends? I need to pause here for just a moment because sharing these memories with you is bringing up so many emotions I thought I had buried long ago. If you're listening to this story and feeling something stir in your heart, if you're recognizing patterns in your own life or the life of someone you love, then please know that you're not alone in this journey. There are so many of us who have walked this painful path, who have discovered that the organizations we trusted with our souls were not what they claimed to be. I want you to subscribe to this channel because I have so much more to share with you, so many more truths that need to be told. And please leave me a comment below telling me where you're listening from, what this story means to you. Your words give me strength to continue sharing these difficult but necessary truths. Together we can help others see through the beautiful lies and find their way to genuine freedom. The turning point came when Linda and I had been married for 8 years, and I had been serving as an elder for 6 of those years. We had finally accepted that we would never have biological children, and Linda had thrown herself into volunteer work at the local animal shelter, finding some purpose and joy in caring for abandoned pets. The elders weren't thrilled about her, spending so much time in worldly activities, but they tolerated it because she was still attending meetings and going out in field service regularly. One evening in late September, we were sitting on our small back porch, watching the sun set behind the maple trees that bordered our property, when Linda turned to me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't sadness or anger or frustration. It was something deeper, something that looked almost like pity. "Raymond," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I've been thinking a lot about our life, about the choices we've made, about the things we've given up to stay in this organization. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had never become Jehovah's Witnesses? If we had been allowed to just be regular people with regular jobs and regular friends and regular problems?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Of course I'd wondered about that, especially late at night when I couldn't sleep, when the weight of all the judicial committee meetings and shepherding calls and organizational responsibilities pressed down on my chest like a stone. But wondering about alternate lives was dangerous territory for someone in my position. Elders weren't supposed to have doubts. We were supposed to be pillars of faith, examples for others to follow. "Linda, you know we can't think like that," I replied automatically, the words coming out before I could stop them. "We have the truth. We're blessed to be part of Jehovah's organization. Everything we've given up has been worth it to serve God." She looked at me for a long moment, and I could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Do you really believe that, Raymond? Or is that just what you tell yourself because it's too terrifying to admit that we might have wasted our entire lives serving men who claim to speak for God but show no more wisdom or love than any other human beings?" That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, Linda's words echoing in my mind. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to really examine my life, to look past the familiar routines and responsibilities and ask myself some hard questions. Was I happy? Did I feel fulfilled? Did I have genuine relationships with people who loved me for who I was, not just because I held a position in their religious hierarchy? The answers were uncomfortable. I realized that I had no real friends outside the organization, no hobbies or interests that weren't somehow connected to Jehovah's Witness activities. My entire identity was wrapped up in being an elder, being a spiritual man, being someone others could look up to. But underneath all those labels, I couldn't find Raymond, the person, anymore. He had been buried under layers of organizational expectations and religious programming. The next few months were like living in a fog. I went through the motions of my elder duties, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. During judicial committee meetings, I found myself questioning the harsh punishments we were imposing on people for what seemed like minor infractions. When we disfellowshipped a 17-year-old girl for kissing her non-witness boyfriend, I watched her parents weep in the parking lot afterward and wondered what kind of God would demand that families tear themselves apart over teenage romance. That breaking point came during a circuit assembly in early spring. The circuit overseer, Brother Martinez, gave a talk about the dangers of higher education, warning parents not to let their children pursue college degrees because it would expose them to worldly thinking and evolutionary teachings. He quoted statistics about how many young witnesses left the organization after attending university, speaking about education as if it were a disease that infected people with pride and independence. I sat in that auditorium, listening to hundreds of parents nod in agreement as this man told them to limit their children's opportunities, to keep them dependent and uneducated so they would never have the tools to think critically about what they were being taught. And in that moment, I understood something that chilled me to the bone. This wasn't about serving God at all. This was about control, pure and simple. After the assembly, Linda and I drove home in silence. But that evening, she brought up something that had been bothering her about Brother Martinez's talk. Raymond, doesn't it seem strange that they're so afraid of education? If we really have the truth, shouldn't it be able to withstand scrutiny? Shouldn't we want our young people to be smart enough to defend their beliefs? Her questions opened a floodgate. Over the next several weeks, we began having conversations that would have been unthinkable just a few months earlier. We talked about the organization's failed prophecies, their changing doctrines, their harsh treatment of anyone who dared to disagree with their interpretations. We discussed the way they isolated members from outside influences, the way they discouraged critical thinking, the way they used fear and guilt to maintain control. But the conversation that changed everything happened on a rainy Thursday evening. In April, we were discussing the organization's policy on blood transfusions, and Linda mentioned a news article she had read about a young mother who had died refusing a transfusion that could have saved her life, leaving behind 3 small children. How is that different from suicide? She asked. How can we claim to value life while refusing medical treatment that could preserve it? And why do they get to decide what medical procedures we can accept? Where in the Bible does it say that blood transfusions are forbidden? I'd heard these arguments before from opposers and apostates, and I had the standard responses ready. But as I started to give them, the words stuck in my throat. Because for the first time, I was really listening to the question instead of just formulating a defense. And I realized that Linda was right. The Bible's prohibitions on eating blood had nothing to do with modern medical procedures. The organization had simply interpreted those scriptures in the most restrictive way possible and then claimed their interpretation was God's law. That night, I did something I had never done in my 30-plus years as a witness. I went to my study and pulled out my Bible, not the organization's publications or study guides, just the Bible itself. And I began reading it as if I was seeing it for the first time, without the filter of watchtower interpretations and explanations. What I discovered over the next few weeks of study shook me to my core. The God I found in those pages was nothing like the harsh, demanding deity the organization portrayed. The Jesus I read about was inclusive and loving, welcoming outcasts and sinners, criticizing religious leaders who laid heavy burdens on people's shoulders. The message of the New Testament was about grace and freedom, not rules and punishment. I began to see how the Watchtower had taken isolated scriptures and twisted them to support their authoritarian structure. They quoted Jesus saying, his followers would be persecuted, but they never mentioned that he also said his yoke was easy and his burden was light. They talked constantly about Jehovah being a God of justice, but they rarely spoke of his mercy and forgiveness. The more I studied, the more I realized that everything I had built my life around was based on the interpretations of a small group of men in New York who claimed divine authority but showed no evidence of divine wisdom. They had taken the beautiful message of Christianity and turned it into a rigid system of control that destroyed families and crushed individual spirits. Linda noticed the change in me immediately. I stopped preparing for meetings with the same enthusiasm, stopped volunteering for extra responsibilities, stopped giving the kind of confident counsel that had once made me a respected elder. During one particularly difficult judicial committee meeting, where we were considering disfellowshipping a single mother for accepting help from a charity connected to another church, I found myself arguing for mercy instead of strict adherence to organizational policy. My fellow elders began to look at me with suspicion. Brother Davis, who had been my mentor for years, pulled me aside after a meeting and asked if everything was all right at home, if I was dealing with some personal crisis that was affecting my spiritual condition. The concern in his voice was genuine, but it was also tinged with worry about how my attitude might affect the congregation. I wanted to tell him everything, to share all the doubts and questions that were eating away at my faith in the organization. But I knew that would be the end of my position, the end of my standing in the congregation, possibly the end of my marriage if Linda wasn't ready to leave with me. So I gave him the answers he wanted to hear, assured him that I was just going through a difficult period and would soon return to my former spiritual strength. But privately, Linda and I were having conversations that would have horrified our former selves. We talked about what life might look like outside the organization, whether we would have the courage to start over at our age, how we could possibly rebuild relationships with family members we had shunned for years because they weren't witnesses. The fear was overwhelming at times. We had no friends outside the organization, no support system beyond the congregation. Our entire social world revolved around Kingdom Hall activities and association with other witnesses. If we left, we would be starting from nothing, building new lives with no safety net and no guarantee that we could make it work. But staying was becoming impossible. Every meeting felt like torture, sitting there listening to teachings I no longer believed, nodding along with policies I found cruel and unbiblical. Every time I gave a talk from the platform, I felt like a fraud, standing before people I cared about and feeding them lies disguised as spiritual truth. The final straw came during a meeting with the other elders to discuss congregation business. Brother Patterson brought up a situation involving a teenage boy who had confided to his parents that he was attracted to other boys. The boy hadn't acted on these feelings, hadn't done anything inappropriate, but his parents were seeking guidance from the elders about how to handle what they saw as a spiritual crisis. The discussion that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my years of service. These men, whom I had respected and looked up to, talked about this confused, frightened teenager as if he were a dangerous criminal. They discussed whether his parents should force him into therapy to change his orientation, whether he should be restricted from certain congregation activities, whether his condition was something that could be prayed away or would require constant vigilance and suppression. I sat there listening to them plan the systematic destruction of a child's self-worth, all in the name of maintaining organizational purity, and I knew I could not be part of it anymore. When they asked for my input on how to counsel the family, I looked around that conference room at men I had once considered spiritual brothers and realized I was sitting among strangers. I think, I said slowly, choosing my words carefully, that our job as elders should be to show love and support to families dealing with difficult situations, not to add to their burden with harsh judgments and impossible demands. The silence that followed was deafening. Brother Davis cleared his throat and suggested we move on to other business, but I could feel the weight of their disapproval settling over me like a heavy blanket. I had crossed a line, and we all knew it. That night, I went home and told Linda everything that had happened in that meeting. When I finished, she took my hands in hers and said the words I had been hoping and dreading to hear. "Raymond, we can't stay here anymore. We have to find the courage to leave, no matter what it costs us." The decision to leave wasn't made overnight. Linda and I spent weeks discussing every possible consequence, every relationship we would lose, every bridge we would burn. We made lists of family members who might cut us off completely, friends who would treat us as if we were dead, financial implications of losing our entire social network. The weight of it all was crushing, but staying had become more unbearable than leaving. Our first step was to stop participating in field service. We told the other elders that Linda was dealing with some health issues that made it difficult for her to walk from house to house for hours every Saturday morning. It wasn't entirely a lie. The stress of our situation was taking a physical toll on both of us. Brother Davis offered to arrange for us to do telephone witnessing instead, but we declined, saying we needed some time to focus on personal study and prayer. The excuses worked for a while, but eventually the questions became more pointed. Why weren't we commenting during the Watchtower study anymore? Why did we seem distracted during meetings? Why weren't we socializing with other couples after the assemblies and conventions? The elders began scheduling shepherding visits, ostensibly to encourage us, but really to investigate what they clearly saw as a spiritual decline. During one of these visits, Brother Patterson and Brother Williams came to our house on a Thursday evening, settling into our living room chairs with their Bibles and notebooks, ready to diagnose whatever spiritual illness they believed was afflicting us. The conversation started pleasantly enough with questions about our health, our marriage, our personal study habits. But gradually it became clear that they were fishing for something specific. "Brother Mitchell," Brother Patterson said, leaning forward in his chair, "we've noticed that you seem less enthusiastic about congregation activities lately. Some of the other elders have mentioned that you've been asking unusual questions during our meetings, questions that could be seen as critical of the organization's policies." I felt Linda tense beside me on the couch. This was the moment we had been dreading, the beginning of the process that would either force us back into line or push us out completely. I took a deep breath and tried to choose my words carefully. "I've been doing a lot of personal Bible study lately," I said, which was true. Sometimes when you really dig into the scriptures, you find things that make you think more deeply about certain teachings. I don't think asking questions means I'm being critical. It means I'm trying to make sure I really understand what I believe. Brother Williams nodded slowly, but his expression was skeptical. "Of course, personal study is important, Raymond, but we need to be careful that we're not allowing our own limited understanding to override the wisdom of the faithful and discreet slave class. The governing body has been appointed by Jehovah to provide spiritual food at the proper time. When we start questioning their direction, we risk falling into the trap of independent thinking." There it was, independent thinking. In the Jehovah's Witness organization, those two words were practically synonymous with apostasy. The idea that an individual could read the Bible and reach conclusions different from those of the governing body was considered dangerous, prideful, satanic. We were supposed to trust completely in the interpretations provided by a small group of elderly men in New York, men we had never met, men who claimed divine authority but provided no evidence beyond their own assertions. "I understand the importance of organizational unity," I replied carefully, "but doesn't the Bible encourage us to test everything and hold fast to what is good? Doesn't it tell us to make sure of all things? How can we do that without asking questions?" The two elders exchanged a look that I knew meant trouble. Brother Patterson opened his Bible to a familiar passage and began reading about the dangers of going beyond what was written, about the importance of submitting to those taking the lead among us, about how Satan disguised himself as an angel of light to deceive even the chosen ones. For the next hour, they quoted scripture after scripture, all filtered through the organization's interpretations, all designed to shut down any independent thought or questioning. They spoke about the importance of waiting on Jehovah, of trusting in his organization, of not running ahead of divine direction. They reminded me of my responsibilities as an elder, the example I was supposed to set for others in the congregation. Linda sat quietly through most of this, but I could see her growing more uncomfortable as the conversation continued. When Brother Williams suggested that perhaps she needed to be more supportive of my spiritual activities, that maybe she was inadvertently contributing to my apparent spiritual weakness, she finally spoke up. "I think Raymond is one of the strongest people I know," she said firmly. "If he's asking questions, it's because he cares about truth, not because he's spiritually weak. Shouldn't we all care more about finding real answers than about just accepting whatever we're told?" The silence that followed was electric with tension. Brother Patterson's face flushed red, and Brother Williams actually gasped audibly. Linda had just challenged the fundamental authority structure of the organization, and we all knew it. After they left that evening, Linda and I sat in our living room without speaking for nearly an hour. We both understood that we had crossed a line from which there was no return. Within days, the other elders would be discussing our spiritual condition. Within weeks, we would likely be facing a judicial committee, the process that would end with our complete ostracism from everyone we had ever known and loved had officially begun. The next few weeks were a nightmare of surveillance and interrogation disguised as loving concern. Different elders would drop by unexpectedly, always with some excuse about needing to discuss congregation business or check on our welfare. They would ask seemingly innocent questions about what we had been reading, who we had been talking to, whether we had been visiting any websites or reading any books that might be influencing our thinking. The paranoia was suffocating. We felt like we were living under a microscope, with every word and action being analyzed for signs of apostasy. Linda started having panic attacks during meetings, and I developed insomnia that left me exhausted and irritable most of the time. The stress was literally making us sick, but asking for a break from congregation activities would only increase suspicion about our loyalty to the organization. Everything came to a head during a circuit overseer's visit in late summer. Brother Rodriguez was known throughout the circuit as a no-nonsense elder who had a reputation for rooting out spiritual problems and dealing with them decisively. He had been making rounds through all the congregations in our area, conducting special meetings with local elders to discuss any concerns they had about their congregation's spiritual health. I knew our situation would be discussed during his visit, but I underestimated how seriously the other elders had been taking our questioning attitude. Brother Rodriguez requested a private meeting with Linda and me on a Saturday afternoon, just before the weekend circuit assembly was scheduled to begin. We met in the back room of the Kingdom Hall, the same room where judicial committees were held. Brother Rodriguez sat across from us at the small table, flanked by Brother Davis and Brother Patterson. The formal setup made it clear that this wasn't a friendly shepherding call. This was an investigation. "Brother and Sister Mitchell," Brother Rodriguez began, his voice stern and authoritative. "I've been hearing some troubling reports about your recent attitude toward the organization. Your fellow elders are concerned that you may be developing doubts about the faithful and discreet slave class and their role in providing spiritual guidance to God's people." For 45 minutes, they grilled us about our beliefs, our study, habits, our association with others. They asked if we had been reading apostate literature, visiting critical websites, or talking to disfellowshipped persons. They wanted to know if we still believed that the governing body was God's channel of communication on earth, if we accepted their authority in all matters of doctrine and practice. I answered their questions as honestly as I could, without immediately triggering a disfellowshipping committee. I told them that I believed in God and Jesus Christ, that I wanted to live according to biblical principles, that I valued truth above all else. But I couldn't bring myself to affirm their claims about organizational authority or the infallibility of the governing body's interpretations. Linda was even more direct. When they asked her if she believed the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society was God's organization, she looked them in the eye and said, "I believe God uses many people to accomplish his purposes, but I don't think he needs a publishing company to speak for him." The meeting ended with Brother Rodriguez informing us that we would be restricted from any teaching activities in the congregation while they continued their investigation into our spiritual condition. I was immediately removed from my position as an elder, though they framed it as a temporary step to help me focus on strengthening my faith. We were also strongly encouraged to limit our association with other congregation members until we had resolved our doubts. That evening, as we drove home from what would be our last meeting at the Millbrook Valley Kingdom Hall, Linda reached over and took my hand. "Raymond," she said softly, "I'm proud of us for finally telling the truth, even if it costs us everything." The next few days were a whirlwind of phone calls, visits, and emergency meetings. Word of our situation spread quickly through the congregation, and people who had been our friends for decades began treating us like we were infected with some contagious disease. Sisters who had shared meals at our house for years suddenly became too busy to talk when Linda called them. Brothers who had worked with me on construction projects and Kingdom Hall maintenance found excuses to avoid me in the grocery store. My own parents called on a Tuesday morning, their voices tight with panic and disappointment. They had heard from the elders that their son was being influenced by Satan, that I was questioning the very organization they had raised me to serve. My mother cried on the phone, begging me to repent of whatever sin was causing me to doubt God's organization. My father was more direct. If I didn't straighten out my attitude immediately, they would have no choice but to limit their contact with us to protect their own spiritual condition. The speed with which our entire world collapsed was breathtaking. In less than 2 weeks, we went from being respected members of a tight-knit community to being pariahs whom others feared to associate with. The shunning hadn't even officially begun, but already we were experiencing the devastating isolation that the organization used as its ultimate weapon of control. But something unexpected happened during those dark days. As we lost our artificial family, Linda and I discovered each other in ways we never had before. Without the constant pressure to maintain our organizational image, we could finally be completely honest about our thoughts, our fears, our hopes for the future. We stayed up late into the night, talking about things we had never dared discuss before. What we actually believed about God, what kind of life we wanted to build, how we could find meaning and purpose outside the only system we had ever known. We also began reaching out tentatively to people we had shunned or ignored during our years as active witnesses. Linda called her sister Sarah, who had been disfellowshipped 10 years earlier for divorcing her abusive husband. Through tears, Linda apologized for years of cruel silence and asked if Sarah could ever forgive her. Sarah's response was immediate and overwhelming. Linda, I've been praying for this day for 10 years. I love you and I never stopped loving you, no matter what that organization told you to do.